man, I was tame compared to what they do now. Are you kidding? I didn't do anything. We just jiggle, you know.
For decades, fans of Elvis Presley wondered why one of Hollywood's most enchanting actresses, Debra Paget, turned down the king of rock and roll at the height of his fame. Their names once blazed across headlines, their chemistry undeniable, their connection seemingly destined for something more. Yet Elvis, a man who could win the heart of almost any woman in the world, was quietly rejected by Paget. For years, she remained silent, fueling rumors of studio interference, family pressure, and even whispers of hidden scandal. But now, at 92 years old, Debra Paget has spoken. Her words cut through decades of speculation, finally revealing the real reason she walked away from Elvis Presley. It is a story of temptation, survival, and sacrifice. A decision that forever altered the paths of two icons. What she has confessed may change everything fans thought they knew about the king's private life. Long before Elvis Presley ever entered her world, Debra Paget was already being shaped into one of Hollywood's brightest rising stars. Born in Denver, Colorado, in 1933, she grew up in a family that encouraged the performing arts. By her teenage years, her striking beauty and graceful presence made her a natural fit for the silver screen. Hollywood, during the 1940s and 1950s, was a machine that carefully molded its stars into images of perfection, and Paget was no exception. When she signed with 20th Century Fox, the studio executives saw in her not just another actress, but a marketable figure who could embody exotic beauty and old-world elegance for biblical epics and costume dramas. Her breakthrough came with roles in films like Broken Arrow, 1950, where she played opposite James Stewart, and Demetrius and the Gladiators, 1954, which solidified her status as a screen goddess. Paget wasn't just another actress cast in fleeting roles. She was a sensation, gracing the covers of magazines and captivating audiences with a combination of innocence and allure that few could rival. Hollywood insiders often remarked that she seemed destined for greatness, but behind the glamour, her career was tightly controlled. The studio dictated not only the parts she played, but also how she looked, how she spoke, and even who she was seen with publicly. It was a world where every step was calculated, every photograph analyzed for its impact on her marketability. Unlike some of her peers who bent or broke the rules, Debra followed them carefully, knowing her career and her family's livelihood depended on it, and family was always at the center of her life. Unlike many actresses who moved independently through Hollywood, Paget was deeply tied to her mother, who acted as both guardian and guiding force in her decisions. She was raised with a strong sense of faith and morality, something that stood out in an industry where temptation was always just a party away. Those values kept her cautious about the spotlight, careful about the choices she made, and hesitant about falling into relationships that could threaten the delicate balance between her public image and her private beliefs. By the mid-1950s, Debra Paget was everywhere. Audiences marveled at her performance in The Ten Commandments, 1956, where she played Lilia in one of the most celebrated epics of all time. The success of that film placed her among Hollywood's most recognizable faces, but it also placed her under even greater scrutiny. She was not just an actress. She was a commodity, and the studio wanted her to remain untouchable, refined, and free of scandal. It was during this period of immense fame that Elvis Presley exploded onto the national stage. His music, charisma, and raw energy captured the attention of millions, and Hollywood saw in him a new kind of leading man who could bring fresh life to the big screen. The studios were eager to connect Elvis with actresses who carried prestige and beauty, and Debra Paget's name rose to the top of that list. When their worlds collided, the meeting seemed almost inevitable. The king of rock and roll, America's most electrifying new star, drawn to the elegant beauty who represented everything Hollywood adored. Yet while to the outside world this seemed like the perfect match, to Paget, It was a complication, one that would force her to balance the demands of fame, her devotion to her family, and the strict control of her studio against the undeniable attraction of Elvis Presley. By 1956, Elvis Presley had become more than just a singer. He was a cultural earthquake shaking the foundations of American music, fashion, and film. His rise from a truck driver in Tupelo, Mississippi, to the biggest star in the world happened almost overnight, and his impact was unlike anything the entertainment industry had ever seen. Teenagers screamed, fainted, and swarmed concert venues, while conservative parents and critics worried about his influence on a generation. With his swiveling hips, smoldering gaze, and raw energy, Elvis became a force Hollywood could not ignore. Studio executives realized that his presence on the silver screen would not only sell tickets, but also redefine what it meant to be a leading man. For his first films, Elvis was carefully paired with actresses who could enhance his appeal and give legitimacy to his acting career. Among them was Debra Paget, who by then had already established herself as one of Hollywood's most captivating performers. When Elvis first encountered her, it wasn't simply admiration, it was infatuation. Those who were close to him at the time recalled how quickly he became enamored with her beauty, her elegance, and her seemingly untouchable aura. Unlike the girls who chased him down after concerts, Paget carried herself with a regal composure that fascinated him. She was everything he wasn't: disciplined, controlled, and steeped in the classical traditions of Hollywood. And that contrast only fueled his determination to win her heart. Elvis pursued her with a sincerity that surprised even his closest friends. He sent flowers, lavished her with attention, and made it clear to those around him that Debra Paget was no passing fancy. At a time when he was linked in the tabloids to a string of young women, insiders whispered that this was different, that Elvis saw in Paget someone he could truly build a life with. Their public appearances together stirred endless speculation. Gossip columns buzzed with rumors of romance, and fans envisioned a glamorous union between the king of rock and roll and one of Hollywood's most admired leading ladies. Yet while Elvis leaned into the possibility of a real relationship, Paget's response was far more complicated. She was polite, warm, and even fond of him, but she never fully embraced his advances. To Elvis, who was used to women falling over themselves for even a moment of his attention, Paget's hesitation was bewildering. Friends recalled how he would speak of her in glowing terms, often wondering aloud why she didn't see what he saw, that they were meant to be. But Paget was not easily swept away. Where others saw the excitement of being pursued by the world's biggest star, she saw danger, pressure, and the possibility of losing control of her carefully built life. For her, Elvis was not simply a man. He was a whirlwind, and stepping into his world could mean surrendering everything she had fought so hard to maintain. It was this tension, the unstoppable force of Elvis Presley, colliding with the immovable caution of Debra Paget, that would define their brief, complicated connection, a connection that even decades later would leave fans asking why she said no. In the golden age of Hollywood, nothing about a star's personal life was truly personal. Studios controlled not only the careers of their actors, but also their reputations, relationships, and in many cases, their private choices. Debra Paget, as one of 20th Century Fox's prized young actresses, lived under that microscope every single day. Every date she went on, every friend she spent time with, and every headline with her name attached was carefully monitored. The studio wasn't just investing in her talent, they were investing in an image, one of purity, refinement, and classical beauty. To executives, she was the perfect embodiment of exotic allure without scandal. A screen siren who drew audiences, but still upheld the standards of decency required in the 1950s. Elvis Presley, however, was another story. To Hollywood insiders, Elvis was both a gold mine and a risk. His name brought unparalleled attention, but his rock and roll persona frightened traditionalists. Parents condemned him as dangerous. Preachers accused him of corrupting youth, and even some studio bosses worried about what his presence meant for actresses carefully cultivated as wholesome icons. Pairing Debra Paget with Elvis Presley was a publicity dream. Two of the most beautiful young stars in the world, their chemistry undeniable. But behind closed doors, the studio became increasingly concerned. What if Paget became romantically entangled with Elvis? What if the newspapers began to portray her as another one of his girls? For an actress whose career rested on elegance and refinement, that image could unravel years of careful grooming. Studio bosses made their disapproval known in subtle but powerful ways. Paget was advised to remain polite but distant, to be seen but not too seen, to protect her reputation above all else. The idea of her being swept away by Presley's fame was seen as reckless and potentially damaging. Even more than her own hesitations, this constant oversight created invisible walls between her and Elvis. For every bouquet of flowers Elvis sent, for every word of affection he shared, there were reminders from executives and handlers that she could not risk her future for the king of rock and roll. To make matters more complicated, Debra's own family, particularly her mother, reinforced the same warnings. They knew that aligning too closely with Presley could brand her as reckless, and in an industry where one scandal could end a career, the stakes were too high. So while Elvis pursued her earnestly, Paget found herself trapped between desire and duty, between what she might have wanted and what she was being told was best for her. To the world outside, the tension was invisible. Fans saw two young stars in the same orbit and dreamed of a fairy tale romance. But within the confines of Hollywood's studio system, the reality was suffocating. Debra Paget was not free to follow her heart. She was a product, carefully packaged and sold to the public, and her handlers were determined that nothing, not even Elvis Presley, would be allowed to tarnish that image. To the outside world, Debra Paget lived a dream life. Lavish premieres, starring roles in biblical epics, and her face on magazine covers across America. But beneath the shimmering surface of stardom, she carried burdens invisible to the public eye. She was not only navigating the ruthless studio system, but also the weight of her own upbringing, one defined by faith, morality, and the ever-watchful presence of her family, especially her mother. Unlike many Hollywood starlets who embraced the freewheeling glamour of parties, alcohol, and scandal, Paget was raised in a deeply conservative environment that saw the film industry as both an opportunity and a battlefield for her soul. Every decision she made had to be measured against the values instilled in her since childhood, values that urged modesty, self-control, and spiritual grounding. And yet she lived in a world that celebrated excess. This internal conflict often left her feeling like she was playing two roles, one for the cameras and one in her private heart. Elvis Presley, with his magnetic charm and intoxicating fame, embodied the very contradiction she feared most. On one hand, she admired his talent, his genuine sweetness off stage, and the way he looked at her as though she were the only woman in the room. On the other hand, she couldn't ignore the chaos that swirled around him, the screaming fans, the temptations that came with constant touring, the whispers of late-night parties, and endless women vying for his attention. For a woman like Paget, who clung to the idea of marriage as a sacred bond and believed in a life built on stability, the whirlwind of Elvis's existence was not romantic. It was frightening. Friends of Debra would later recall how cautious she was, how she spoke of her fears that marrying a man like Elvis would lead her into a world where she would lose herself completely. It wasn't just about preserving her career, it was about protecting her spirit. She wanted love, yes, but she wanted a love grounded in peace, faith, and security, not in the unpredictable highs and lows of rock and roll fame. Compounding her worries was the immense influence of her mother, Margaret, who was fiercely protective of her daughter's reputation and well-being. Margaret had already seen how Hollywood destroyed young women with promise And she was determined not to let Debra become another casualty of broken marriages, addictions, or scandals that devoured so many starlets. Her advice was firm. Elvis might be charming, but he was not safe. And Debra, torn between her own conflicted feelings and the counsel of the person she trusted most, chose restraint over surrender. This choice, however, came at a cost. Turning down Elvis was not simply saying no to a man. It was saying no to the possibility of a life lived in the center of the cultural storm, a life that might have brought her even greater fame, but also unimaginable heartache. In rejecting him, she protected herself, but she also carried the quiet sorrow of what might have been. That private battle between longing and fear, between affection and survival, would become one of the most defining struggles of her life. And decades later, she would finally reveal just how much it shaped the path she chose. For Elvis Presley, rejection was a concept he rarely encountered, especially when it came to matters of the heart. By the time he crossed paths with Debra Paget, he was already a national sensation, adored by millions of women who screamed his name, fainted at his concerts, and dreamed of being the one to tame the king of rock and roll. Yet with Debra, it was different. She didn't melt under his gaze, didn't rush to accept his advances, and didn't let his fame sway her into a quick romance. To Elvis, that very hesitation made her all the more captivating. Friends close to him during those early years remembered how serious he was when he spoke of Paget. Unlike the fleeting crushes and playful dalliances he enjoyed with countless admirers, his affection for Debra carried weight. He confided in his inner circle that she was the kind of girl you marry, someone who radiated class and purity, someone who could soften the wild edges of his life. Determined to win her over, Elvis introduced her to his beloved parents, Vernon and Gladys Presley. This was no small gesture. He had brought very few women into that sacred circle. Gladys, in particular, saw in Debra a young woman who carried herself with dignity, and she quietly approved of her son's interest. Elvis, fueled by both youthful passion and a genuine desire for stability, believed that Paget might be the answer to a question he had not yet admitted to the world. How could he be both Elvis Presley, the global superstar, and Elvis Presley, the man searching for love and normalcy? He courted her with persistence, sending flowers, making calls, and finding ways to be near her, despite the chaos of his own schedule. He wasn't subtle about his intentions either. Insiders recalled how Elvis would talk about her openly, telling friends that he wanted her by his side, not just as a date for premieres, but as a partner in life. But for all his persistence, Debra remained unmoved. She was gracious and kind toward him, never dismissive or cruel, but she maintained a distance that Elvis could not fully understand. To him, the rejection wasn't about him personally. After all, millions adored him. It was about something deeper he couldn't quite put his finger on, and that mystery gnawed at him. He was used to women being dazzled by his fame, yet here was one who seemed to see past the glitter and the stardom, straight into the man he was struggling to be. That, more than anything, made her refusal sting. The more she resisted, the more determined he became, and yet every attempt to close the gap only reminded him of the wall she had built to protect herself. The king of rock and roll, who had conquered stages, charts, and hearts across the globe, found himself powerless in the face of a single woman's quiet strength. For Elvis, Debra Paget became less of a romantic pursuit and more of an enigma, a reminder that not everything could be won through charm, persistence, or fame. And as the years went by, her refusal would linger in his memory as one of the rare moments when even the king could not get what he wanted. For years, fans speculated about why Debra Paget turned down Elvis Presley. Some blamed the studios, others pointed to her protective mother, while many assumed she simply wasn't interested. But now, at 92, Debra herself has finally broken the silence, and the truth she revealed was far more complex and deeply personal than anyone imagined. In her own words, she admitted that she cared for Elvis, admired him, and even felt drawn to him in ways that surprised her. She described him as tender, sincere, and unlike the wild persona he projected on stage. Yet she knew, even then, that accepting his love would mean stepping into a whirlwind that she could not survive. "I cared for him, but I knew it would destroy me," she confessed, her voice steady but tinged with the weight of decades past. It wasn't disdain that drove her away. It was fear. Fear not of Elvis himself, but of the world that came with him. She had watched other women in Hollywood become entangled in romances that ended in scandal, heartbreak, and ruin. She had seen careers crumble under the weight of bad press and reputations tarnished by the wrong choice of partner. And she had lived long enough in the shadow of the studio system to know that one wrong step could undo everything she had worked for. With Elvis, the risk was even greater. He wasn't just a star, he was a phenomenon. A man who couldn't walk down the street without mobs forming, who couldn't go on stage without chaos erupting. To love him would mean sacrificing privacy, stability, and peace. To marry him would mean living forever under the glare of the public eye, where every smile, every argument, every slip of behavior would be magnified 1,000 times. For a woman raised in faith and discipline, who longed for a quiet family life built on trust and devotion, that was too heavy a price to pay. Debra also admitted that Elvis's own battles frightened her. Even in those early years, she sensed the weight of fame pressing on him, the way he leaned on music to escape pressures he couldn't articulate, and the way temptation followed him at every turn. She worried that his path, as bright as it was, led toward shadows that she had no strength to walk through. Her decision, then, was not a cold rejection, but an act of survival. She chose to protect herself, to preserve the life she wanted, even if it meant turning away from a man who genuinely loved her. And though Elvis may never have fully understood, Debra carried no bitterness. Speaking now, she said she always respected him, always prayed for him, and always remembered him not as the king of rock and roll, but as the young man who looked at her with hope in his eyes. Her revelation strips away the myths and the rumors, leaving behind a portrait of two people caught between love and destiny. Elvis, desperate to claim her heart, and Debra, desperate to save her own. It was a decision that defined the rest of her life, and stands as one of the most striking what-ifs in Hollywood history. After Debra Paget's quiet but firm rejection of Elvis Presley, their lives began to move in separate directions, each path shaped by choices that would ultimately define their legacies. For Elvis, the pain of losing someone he had genuinely admired was buried beneath the noise of fame, but it left an imprint. He would go on to become the most iconic entertainer of the 20th century, a man whose music electrified generations and whose image became larger than life. Yet alongside the glittering career came the turbulence of personal struggles, his volatile relationships, his dependence on prescription drugs, and the suffocating pressures of superstardom. Fans saw the triumphs, the sold-out concerts, the movies, and the adoration. But behind closed doors, Elvis battled demons that Debra Paget had sensed even in the earliest days. Her instincts, which told her that life with him would consume her, were tragically validated as the years unfolded. Meanwhile, Debra's journey took her down a quieter road, one away from the chaos of rock and roll and the flashing cameras of scandal. She continued working in Hollywood for a time, appearing in films that highlighted her unique combination of beauty and grace, but eventually, she made a decision few expected. She stepped away from the industry that had made her famous. Choosing faith, family, and spiritual devotion, she built a life grounded not in fame, but in peace. While Elvis's story became one of tragedy mixed with triumph, Debra's story became one of withdrawal and preservation, a deliberate retreat from a world that demanded more than she was willing to give. Though she never spoke publicly of her decision at the time, those who knew her best understood that rejecting Elvis had been more than just a personal choice. It had been a turning point. Had she said yes, Her life would have been consumed by the relentless demands of Presley's orbit. By saying no, she secured for herself a life that, while quieter, gave her the stability she craved. And yet, the question of what if never completely disappeared. Fans speculated for decades about how history might have been rewritten if Debra Paget had become Mrs. Elvis Presley. Would Elvis have found the grounding he so desperately needed? Would her faith and strength have saved him from the self-destructive path that eventually claimed his life? Or would she have been pulled down into the same spiral? Another tragic figure lost in the chaos of fame? These unanswered questions kept their story alive long after their romance ended. Debra herself admitted that she sometimes wondered what might have happened, but she remained firm that her decision had been the right one. She lived to see Elvis's rise, his struggles, and ultimately his untimely death at just 42. And with each chapter of his story, she was reminded of why she had walked away. Their paths, so closely intertwined for a brief, shining moment, diverged permanently, leaving behind a lingering sense of destiny interrupted. Elvis Presley became the king, immortalized in music and legend, while Debra Paget chose a different kind of immortality, one of spiritual devotion, private strength, and a legacy not measured by headlines, but by the quiet life she built away from the storm. Looking back now, at 92 years old, Debra Paget's decision to reject Elvis Presley is no longer just a forgotten footnote in Hollywood gossip columns. It is a defining chapter in the lives of two icons whose paths briefly crossed, but ultimately diverged forever. For Elvis, the rejection of the woman he openly admired served as a rare reminder that his fame and charm did not guarantee him everything he desired. He would go on to marry Priscilla Beaulieu, father a daughter, and continue building the towering legacy that made him a cultural giant. But those who knew him best understood that Elvis long carried the memory of Debra as the one who said no when nearly everyone else said yes. And for Debra, the choice became a cornerstone of her own life. By stepping away from Elvis, she preserved the stability she valued most, the grounding that came not from fame or power, but from faith and personal conviction. She would later withdraw almost completely from Hollywood, marrying, raising a family, and devoting herself to her spiritual life. While Elvis was consumed by the blinding spotlight of superstardom, Paget found her peace in a life of relative obscurity, living by the values instilled in her since childhood. And in doing so, she survived an industry that left many of her peers broken and lost. The legacy of her choice echoes loudly in the way fans continue to wonder what might have been. What if she had said yes? Could her unwavering faith and steady presence have been the anchor Elvis so desperately needed? Could she have saved him from the destructive patterns that plagued his personal life? Or would she have been another casualty of the king's unstoppable momentum? These questions can never be answered, yet they remain an essential part of the myth surrounding both their lives. What we do know is that Debra's decision was not made out of cruelty, arrogance, or indifference. It was a conscious act of survival, a recognition that love, no matter how alluring, can sometimes come at too high a cost. At 92, when asked to reflect, she spoke not with bitterness, but with clarity. She remembered Elvis not as the untouchable king of rock and roll, but as a young man, charming, vulnerable, and deeply sincere. She respected him, prayed for him, and carried his memory with quiet grace, even as she chose a life that kept her far from the turmoil of his world. And in that truth lies the power of her revelation. It humanizes Elvis, reminding us that beneath the legend was a man who longed for love and stability. And it illuminates Debra's quiet strength, the strength to say no in an era when saying no to someone like Elvis Presley seemed impossible. Their story is not one of scandal, but of crossroads, of a woman who valued peace over chaos, and of a man who never stopped searching for the grounding he never fully found. Decades later, fans continue to be captivated by their brief connection, Perhaps because it speaks to something universal, the choices we all face between desire and survival, between love and self-preservation. In rejecting Elvis Presley, Debra Paget not only altered the course of her own destiny, but also left us with one of Hollywood's most haunting what-ifs, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful legacy is not in the life we share with someone else, but in the strength it takes to walk away.